Hello, Grandmasters. Mike Amori, WCA. Nice job today, 4 p.m. class. It was a difficult session. Yeah, we didn't get to play. We just went over this wonderful game between Anatoly Karpov and Viktor Korchnoi from World Championship in 1981. We have a position here with Korchnoi playing white and Karpov playing black. It is a standard Queen's Gambit decline opening. I'll just quickly take you through the opening moves, which actually started as an English opening, but after a couple of moves, we have a transposition. And I'll put that in the notes. You should know what that means. So d4, bishop e7. This was kind of a waiting move to see how white was going to develop. And knight f3, and then after this kind of cat and mouse game, we get to a standard Queen's Gambit decline position. Karpov plays h6, and that move is useful in several ways. You're kind of tempoing the bishop, asking white, do they want to trade the bishop straight away for the knight, or win a tempo, have the bishop move away. In this case, Korchnoi moves it away, and there's even this knight e4 idea. I think this is called Lasker's defense, but Karpov just does not play that. He castles his king, and then rook to c1. And here, black decides to give up the center. And one of the key concepts in learning and opening is going over master games and watching when they fight for the center and then when they give it away. When they give it away this early, especially with black, you can almost guarantee that they're going to be fighting for it immediately again. So what happens here is Karpov takes the pawn, and he's going to have Korchnoi try to hang on to it, or get it back, rather, which he does. He plays pawn to e3, and you see the bishop up here on f1 about to snap off the pawn. But remember what I said a second ago. So here's Karpov giving up his d-pawn. This opening very often is a battle for the d5 square. See the bishop here? Pinning the knight or attacking the knight that was defending d5. Why does that knight keep jumping? Come back. Thank you very much. This is one of the openings where the d5 square is really, really important. Even in this particular variation, we spent almost the full 90 minutes talking about this d5 square. So watch again. He gives up his post on d5. Korchnoi develops, attacking the pawn, but c5, immediately challenging the white center. White takes the pawn, and here black takes the pawn in the middle, trying to just break down the white center. White in this position could take with the knight. Trading queens here, not sure that that's really what white started the day with, just getting rid of the queen so quickly. The position will be a little bit dry, but Korchnoi takes on the sharpest way to recapture, which is with the pawn. And by taking with the pawn, we have an IQP. You all have to know what that means, an isolated queen's pawn. Those pawns, as we study more and more of them, you're going to learn that it is a structure you absolutely have to know. And you almost can't avoid them in your games. No matter how you try, sometimes your opponent will play moves or force you into a line where somebody has an isolated queen pawn. So it's good to know how to play with them and against them. When you have them, which will be the feature of the next game that we study on week 3, there is a certain way to play. When you're playing against them, it's a good idea to, if possible, trade a couple of minor pieces. The more you trade, the weaker this pawn becomes. It's also very important to keep an eye, very close eye on the d5 square, and keep a very close eye on the pawn on d4, because the pawn is weak, meaning no other pawns can protect it, right? So we're going to attack it, and if we can control the square in front of it, we can use it in the future as an outpost square, or a blockading square rather, and we can prevent it from pushing forward, okay? So just a little introduction. Knight to c6. Knight to c6. Let's go back to this position with black to play. In this kind of position, you don't really see moves like knight c6 played too much. It's the same square, but you'll notice in the queen pawn opening, if you play a move like knight c6 with the c pawn blocked, it takes away your natural break. So can you play knight c6? Yeah, you can, but I would highly recommend for now that you guys don't do that in the queen pawn openings. Don't block the c pawn. But in the position that we have here, after e takes d4, Karpov puts the knight on c6 because the c pawn has already done its job. Castle. And let's go to the first theme I talked about when you're playing against the isolated queen pawn. So in this position, Karpov plays knight h5. Looks kind of bizarre. You put your knight on the edge of the board, but if you look at the dark squared bishops kind of staring at each other, by putting the knight here on h5, right here, I'll give it a little wiggle, the bishop here doesn't really have a choice. If it goes to g3, it can be taken at some point by the knight, and then the knight doesn't look so silly in the corner. So what Karpov is banking on is that if you trade with me, and Korchnoi did trade with him, that he's not going to get in trouble having this knight loose, especially being stared at by the queen. So you have to be real careful putting a knight on the edge of the board, especially if it's loose and being indirectly attacked by the queen. But there are no tactics in this position that work out. So the trade takes place on e7. And here it was important to take back with the knight. Again, an awkward move to play, but he did not want to allow this pawn to push at any point. So what he did by taking with the knight is he puts extra control over that important d5 square. So if you can't push the pawn remains weak and the blockading square remains open. Here Korchnoi pulls his bishop back. In these isolated pawn positions, you will very often see players move the bishop back. Sometimes with this pawn on a3, you'll still see that move being played. And then you'll see this bishop pull back sometimes to a2, and then come here to the b1 square. And the idea would be to make a battery with the queen and point it at you-know-who. So bishop to b3 gets the bishop off the c-file, and perhaps in the future it will line up and create a battery. Notice it is still keeping its eye on this important d5 square. Karpov pulls the knight back home. Again, you see what the square under focus here is. And now let's talk about one of the benefits of this pawn. It's the e5 and c5 squares. The pawn does a really nice job of guarding these squares. Black doesn't have a c-pawn, right? So this line is open. White, being the only person with a d-pawn, means the diagonal squares attached to it are great landing squares for the knight. So he plunks it in. Let's look ahead a little bit. If you were to try to get rid of this knight by playing the move f6, that means you have to put this knight somewhere, number one. Number two, you have to be really careful about moving that f-pawn, creating holes on these light squares, especially with this bishop pointing in this direction. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. This is somewhat of an outpost square because you're not going to be able to kick it very quickly. So black offers white a trade, a chance to play knight takes bishop. To do that, you will have moved this knight 3 times. You know, you develop it, you move it, you trade it for a bishop that's only moved once. If white takes, black takes back here, and black will, of course, you're going to connect black's rooks. And it's tempting to take off this bishop. But if you look at it right now, it's just strictly playing a defensive role. So here, queen e2 is played. And I caution the class that you have to be careful when you follow your plans. Karpov wants to put this bishop on c6 to activate the piece. You never know. There could be an attack against the white king. But Karpov is playing more positionally here. He's just really keeping an eye on the square and maybe looking to get some advantage in the late middle game or end game. But, you know, you never know. It could happen. If you put it there right away, however, you have to be really careful because there are tactics that spring up in these positions. How is the move knight takes f7? I mean, just look at it for a minute. It's a very common theme that comes up in these positions. This stuff has all been played before, these positions. Masters who get these structures, they kind of study these positions in advance. So there's no coincidence that Korchnoi put his queen up here on e2. It connects his rooks, but it's not randomly connecting the rooks. So what does black do? If you take with the rook, which seems like the best idea, white's going to take the pawn, and white now has 2 pawns for the sacrificed knight. But if you look a little bit deeper, there is some compensation. I think Ruben in the class recommended the move queen takes d4, and he admitted to us he'll love to take material. So if you're playing Ruben, just give him a pawn or 2 or 3 or 4, and he's going to take them all. And maybe when he's taking the pawns, you can mate him. And if you don't mate him, he's going to turn those pawns into queens. So here, what are we looking at? A full pawn for a piece? That's it? Is there compensation? Well, somebody in the class rightly suggested maybe rook f to e1. And this is the kind of position that if you set it up on a chessboard, you have to spend some time looking at it to see if there is compensation. I would recommend you set it up for the black side too. So if you're studying this game with black, you can put this position on the board, and you might say to yourself, he has 1 pawn for a whole piece, but then just keep staring at the board and ask what your next move is going to be and what your plan is as black. And you'll see that it's not really that easy to get control of the board or start an attack. So this is an interesting position, maybe one that we can play out someday. So this didn't happen. Karpov did not allow this. So if we go back after queen e2, he leaves the bishop on d7, controlling the e6 square, and plays the move rook to c8. Okay, so I mentioned in class that some of these moves were criticized. And when I say criticized, writers and other masters look at these games and kind of say, oh, maybe these players could have done better. And I mean, what do I know? This is a world championship game. After knight to e4, the criticism was it allowed Karpov to trade off a piece, which was part of the original plan as black. Let's trade some pieces, if we can, and make this pawn weaker, because the more pieces that come off, the less chance for tactics. So after queen e4, now bishop c6 hit the queen. And by hitting the queen, there's no time for this knight takes f7 nonsense. And here, white decides to make another trade and takes. And Karpov takes back with the rook. And we talked about in class, if you were to go for this trade on c6, you would feel or think that taking with the knight is the most natural way to take back. But if you do, you might get hit with the move d5. And this is kind of a freeing move for white. The position is still relatively equal. I mean, there's only 1 minor piece each. But if you make this trade and continue to trade, we now have a situation where it's bishop against knight, 5 pawns against 5, symmetrical pawn structure, but the bishop having the ability to swing to all sides of the board quickly might give white a slight edge. Winning, I don't think you can say anybody is winning here, but people who like the endgame might take their chances with the white pieces. But Karpov, interestingly enough, if Korchnoi did take the rook on c6, he's not taking with the knight. He's actually going to take with the pawn, which we said in class was counterintuitive, right? Because you shatter, you isolate 2 of your pawns. You had this beautiful structure. Why would you do this? But this position is really equal. The bishop on f3 with these pawns on light squares are not that easy, or it's not that easy to get this thing really rocking and rolling. It's hard to do. The d5 square becomes even stronger now because the knight would be protected twice. Is this pawn a weakness? Yes, it is. but so is this d4 pawn. And now with pawns on e6 and c6, you're never pushing this thing. This will remain weak for the rest of the game, and again, there's chances for both sides. So that was an interesting occurrence that could have happened. Okay, so after the rook move, there was no trade on c6. So we have knight takes bishop, rook takes, and here rook to c3, offering a chance to possibly trade and connect the pawns in the middle of the board. Karpov has none of it. He plays queen to d6, allowing the rook on f8 to come in the game, and rather than focus his attention on the open c file, he keeps it on the weak pawn at d4. g3, another move that was, thought to maybe not play the best with this pawn, because it does open a hole near the king. But right now, not the ends of the world, but just some of the people who wrote about this game weren't 100% sure about g3. Karpov just lines up against the pawn. Now let me make a few moves. Rook d1, protecting the pawn. Here, black wants to triple on the d file, and one of you got caught wanting to play bishop to d7, queen to d7, and you missed that bishop a4 is going to win an exchange here. So what Karpov does is he swings his queen, his rook to b6. He just plays rook to b6 first, getting the rook off this diagonal, and there's just some maneuvering between the pieces. Queen to d7, rook c to d3, just protecting, and at this point it looks like Korchnoi realizes it's time for defense. He's not going to win this game unless Karpov blunders. He's just going to have to hold him off with this pawn. If he can, he'll make a draw. Rook to d6, tripling up. Queen to e4, protecting, offering the queen trade. Remember, the more pieces that come off the board, the weaker the d pawn. No thank you, I don't want to trade. Knight into d5, tempoing the queen. Queen to d2, tripling the defense. Queen to b6. Little bit of a cat and mouse game, a maneuvering game, and here Korchnoi goes for the trade on d5, thinking he can just hold the position. The rook takes back. Black a little better, clearly, by the space that these major pieces have. A little more mobility, and this poor pawn here, he's got all three pieces lined up directly behind it. Look at this, by the way. Look at that. That's 10, 20, 29 points and plus 1, 30 points of power on the d file. Rook to b3, hitting the queen, queen c6, and just some maneuvering, offering a queen trade, fixing the structure, no thank you, and now f4. Okay, after f4, this part of the board started to open up. b6, freeing the queen, so the rook cannot bother the b pawn. Rook to b4, and now b5. Just gaining space and limiting the mobility. This rook is starting to get boxed out. Korchnoi breaks the box. Karpov accepts. Queen a3, pawn a5, encouraging rook takes pawn. So there's a weakness here, and that's counterbalanced by the weakness here. Queen to b5, and it's just this little give and take position. Some people here, they thought that maybe the queen should drop back to guard the first rank, but already black's position is superior, and white is starting to creak a little bit. He plays rook to d2, and rook d2 allowed a little tactical shot. e5. Yeah, there's a nasty pin here. So pawn takes, rook takes, and now here queen e1. Queen a1, I'm sorry. And if you look at the position here, black is already lost. And I think Korchnoi just missed this little combination that comes. Can you guys remember what black played here, just basically to win the game? Queen e8, threatening winning the queen upstairs here on d1, e1. So pawn takes, rook takes d2, rook takes a5. Karpov down a pawn. queen to c6, and this is pure tactics now, just pure attack, calculation, no defense for white. The threat is checkmate on g2. So a check puts the king on h7, a check puts the pawn here, queen b1 check, on g6. With the pawn on g6, that really leaves this pawn the last chance for white. So white plays queen f1, hoping for queen takes rook. And after queen f7, you have a perpetual check. You can work that out for yourself. It's a dead draw. So that did not happen. So Karpov saw that and said, nah, I don't want your rook. Not yet. Queen c5. King h1, the only move. And now you just have to maneuver your pieces to win the white queen. Queen d5 check. And Korchnoi resigned. There's no way to stop rook to d1. Okay? There's a model game. Model game. If you want to go over it with the notation, be my guest. Go over it with a coach. You guys are the best.